So I'm going to be arguing that building a border wall is not positive for America's national security. There's a couple of different ways that we can do that. Most importantly, we need to examine the cost benefit analysis, whether the huge expenditure that it would take to build a wall across the entire border is worth it to the taxpayers who would be footing the bill for that. Does it actually improve our national security? And is it effective? And is there actually a threat from illegal immigration to our national security that we need to be spending this much money trying to prevent in the first place? So first of all, when we talk about cost benefit analysis, spending on immigration in 1993 increased by a large amount when we decided to focus on an enforcement of border enforcement strategy. It's gone from about 363 million to about 4.7 billion per year now. What do we get from such a high cost? What the analysis has shown us is that the amount of border stops that we make and the prevention of illegal entry does not rise at the same rate as the spending rises. So we don't get much for our worth for our money, for the increased money that we're spending. So basically what we're looking at is spending a lot of money with not a lot of improved results. It's not efficient. And when we talk about the issue of whether there's a risk that demands such a great expenditure from illegal immigrants, what the studies have shown is that illegal immigrants or undocumented workers do not commit crimes at a higher rate than American citizens, and in fact sometimes lower. So they don't pose a threat that seems to merit such an expenditure. Now, as for the practical issue of a wall, we know that it's impossible to build the wall across the entire border because of mountainous, treacherous terrain. What has happened is that where we have built wall, so far we've got about 700 miles, is that we've funneled people into more dangerous routes to the point where U.S. Border Patrol now tells us that about one person a day dies from attempting a crossing. So the cost in lives already, which is we're in some ways responsible for by forcing people into these dangerous routes, may not be worth it either. Now, it's also important to remember that the demand for jobs from Mexico for people coming into America was very high in the 1960s and on because Mexico's birth rate was so high that there simply weren't enough jobs within their own country, so they were forced to come elsewhere. The birth rate has gone down from the 60s from 7.7 to now about equal with America, 2.2. And that has a lot to do with why the amount of attempted border crossings from Mexico has decreased. That's probably a lot more to do with it than how effective our border crossing prevention methods have been. So right now Trump wants about 2.6 billion more to continue his wall expenditure. That's a huge amount of money, and it takes that out of other defense spending. And what we're seeing is that the gains seem to be very incremental from this kind of spending, and the returns that we make on all this spending are only going to continue to diminish. And that's for three reasons primarily. First of all, arrivals at the border increasingly are made by asylum seekers from Central American countries, not migrants, economic migrants from Mexico. This is harder to deter because these are people who face horrible conditions at home, and we have a legal obligation to consider these serious requests for asylum. Secondly, a majority of new additions to the undocumented American population are people who arrive on legal visas and then outstay them. That has nothing to do with a wall. A wall will not prevent that. And a growing percentage of repeat offenders attempting border crossings are people who have left children behind in America, and those are people that will not be deterred by a wall. If they've got children to come back to, it's very unlikely that will prevent these attempts. So what we basically see is that a lot of our immigration now is not the traditional immigration from Mexico through the border. It comes from people arriving in our airports, And we see that a wall is a huge expenditure that seems to avoid and not tackle the major areas where this immigration is coming from. It seems like it would be much more effective to focus our spending on looking at the problem less as a national security threat, but how do we incorporate people who are coming to our country because of the threats that they face at home, the economic and political threats that they face, and look at that as a way to welcome them and integrate them into our country rather than spending money on this failed prevention method.